Well, hello, wild wanderers and fellow nature nerds. Hope you're enjoying the end of your summer. I recently noticed milkweed getting ready to go to seed, and I can't see milkweed without thinking of monarch butterflies. Now, if you're unfamiliar with monarchs or with milkweed, well, you've come to the right place, because that's what today's episode is all about. We're going to get away from the solifuges and the scorpions and the creepy crawlies, get to something a little more charismatic. But for now, let me just say that monarchs and milkweed go together like peanut butter and jelly. And it's hard to talk about monarch butterflies without talking about viceroy butterflies because, well, they look almost identical. So let's delve into the butterfly royalty and learn more about monarchs and viceroys. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Monarch butterflies are probably one of, if not the most familiar butterfly in North America. And honeybees aside, they're also one of the most iconic pollinators. Their 3.5 to 4 inch wings, which is around 9 to 10 centimeters for anyone outside the United States, features a pattern of black and orange with small white spots around the outer edge. But let's talk about life cycle for a minute. Monarch courtship occurs in 2 phases. During the aerial phase, a male pursues a female and attempts to force her to the ground, which only works about 30% of the time. But when it does work, it leads to the second phase, the ground phase, which is where the pair copulates, remaining attached to each other for 30 to 60 minutes. Pretty impressive. Now, like all butterflies, monarchs undergo complete metamorphosis, and their life cycle has 4 phases: egg, larva, aka caterpillar, pupa, and adult. In the warm days of summer, this whole cycle takes as little as 25 days, but during the cooler days in the spring, it can take as long as 7 weeks. Now, the first half of this cycle is where milkweed comes into play. Female monarchs lay eggs singly, usually on the underside of a young milkweed leaf during the spring and summer. They secrete a small amount of what's basically glue to attach their eggs directly to the plant. An individual female can lay 300 to 500 eggs over a 2 to 5 week period. She can then mate again and altogether lay nearly 1,200 eggs in her lifetime. But that said, between weather extremes, predators, parasites, and diseases, it's not uncommon for less than 10% of monarch eggs and caterpillars to survive to adulthood. Eggs generally hatch in 3 to 8 days, and of course what emerges are butterfly larvae, better known as caterpillars. The caterpillars go through 5 stages or instars, each lasting 3 to 5 days, molting after each one. And as they grow and progress through each instar, monarch caterpillars feed exclusively on milkweed. When they get to the 5th instar, the caterpillars increase significantly in size and weight. Then they stop feeding and move, often far from milkweed, looking for a safe place to pupate. Once the caterpillar finds a suitable spot, it spins a silk pad underneath a horizontal surface, like a leaf or a branch. Now at this point it turns around and securely latches on with its last pair of hind legs and hangs upside down in the form of a letter J. Now after hanging like this for 12 to 16 hours or so, it straightens out and goes into peristalsis, a rhythmic movement along the length of its body. This lasts for several seconds until the skin splits behind its head. Then it sheds its skin over the next few minutes, revealing a green chrysalis. So the chrysalis is not a pouch containing the caterpillar, it is the body of the caterpillar. Now at first the chrysalis is long, soft, and somewhat amorphous, but over the next few hours it compacts into a distinct shape, an opaque pale green chrysalis with small golden dots near the bottom and a gold and black rim near the top on the front side. But what happens inside the chrysalis of a pupating butterfly is, well, not a complete mystery, but it's still some kind of voodoo nature magic. Basically, over the next 1 to 2 weeks, the caterpillar turns into goop and reforms into a butterfly. Now, a day or so before emerging, the exoskeleton becomes translucent and the chrysalis turns a little more bluish. And within 12 hours or so, it becomes transparent enough to see the black and orange colors of the butterfly inside, and then it emerges. The newly emerged adult hangs upside down for several hours while it pumps fluid and air into its wings, which expand, dry, and stiffen. While the caterpillars feed exclusively on milkweed, adults feed on a variety of nectar-producing plants. They're not particularly effective at pollinating milkweed. But let's come back to those bright colors for a second. In both caterpillar and butterfly form, monarchs are aposematic, something I've talked about before. Those bright colors are a warning to potential predators that, at best, they taste bad, and at worst, they're poisonous. Since the caterpillars eat milkweed, which contains toxic substances, they concentrate these toxins, which they're immune to, in their bodies. Interestingly, after pupating, the toxins shift to different parts of the body. Since many birds attack the wings of the butterfly, there are 3 times the amount of toxins in the wings. A predator that attacks the wings will be left with a foul taste, which might stop them from ever attempting to ingest the body. And it's a good thing too, because on the other hand, to combat predators that might remove the wings and only ingest the body, monarchs have less but more concentrated toxins in their abdomens. Still, there are several species of birds and some species of mice that have evolved ways to ingest monarchs without getting sick. Overwintering adults also become less toxic over time, making them more vulnerable to predators. Which brings us to the migration of the monarchs. It's mainly the North American monarch species that engage in long-distance migration. In other parts of the world, monarchs migrate short distances or sometimes not at all. But here in North America, the massive movement of butterflies is considered to be one of the most spectacular natural phenomena in the world. They begin their southward migration in September and October. East of the Rocky Mountains, migratory monarchs originating in southern Canada and the northern United States travel thousands of miles to overwintering sites in central Mexico and Florida. West of the Rocky Mountains, monarchs migrate to southern California. Now, at a top speed of about 6 miles an hour, they arrive in their roosting sites in November. Adult butterflies that migrate south live 8 times longer than their parents and grandparents. Now, the northward migration is a multi-generational affair. Butterflies that overwintered east of the Rockies may reach as far north as Texas or Oklahoma during the spring migration, but it will be the 3rd and sometimes even the 4th generation that makes it all the way to the northernmost locations in the US and Canada in the springtime. Now, this long migration makes monarch conservation a tricky business. In February of 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reported a study showing a reduction of nearly 1 billion monarchs from their overwintering sites since 1990. Now, there's a couple of possible reasons why. Habitat loss from illegal logging in the Mexican forests where monarchs overwinter, that certainly doesn't help. Meanwhile, on the breeding grounds and along the migration route, monarchs are also losing habitat. U.S. Fish and Wildlife attributed their decline, at least in part, to a loss of milkweed caused by herbicides used by farmers and homeowners. So, if you want to help monarchs, reduce herbicide use and plant milkweed. But don't just plant any old species of milkweed, plant one that's native to your region. There's evidence to suggest that tropical milkweed, which is often planted in the U.S. as an ornamental in butterfly gardens, can adversely impact migration patterns and lead to a buildup of harmful parasites. But there may be another factor at play in this decline as well. Eastern and Midwestern monarchs seem to be having a harder time even reaching the overwintering sites in Mexico. A number of monarch researchers have cited recent evidence obtained from long-term community science data indicating that the number of adult breeding monarchs has not declined in the last 2 decades. So what does that mean? Well, the lack of decline in the number of breeding and migratory monarchs, but the clear decline in overwintering numbers, suggests that there's a growing disconnect between these 2 life stages. One researcher suggested that car strikes are an increasing problem for migrating monarchs. A study of road mortality in northern Mexico, published in 2019, showed very high mortality from just 2 specific hotspots every year, amounting to a loss of about 200,000 monarchs. How to solve that one, I have no idea. Planting milkweed isn't going to help. Okay, now let's take a look at Viceroy butterflies. It's easy to see how Viceroys and monarchs could be mistaken for one another. But Viceroys are smaller, a 2 to 3 inch wingspan compared to the monarch's 3.5 to 4. But the color and pattern of the Viceroy is nearly identical to that of the monarch, except the Viceroy has black lines on its hind wings running roughly perpendicular to the body. Now, it used to be thought that this similarity in looks meant that the Viceroy was what's called a Batesian mimic of the monarch. A Batesian mimic is something that isn't toxic or dangerous, but looks like something else that is. Flies that look like bees and non-venomous snakes that look like venomous snakes are just a couple of examples. Predators familiar with the real thing also tend to avoid the mimic. But it turns out that the host plant for Viceroy caterpillars are trees in the willow family: willows, poplars, and cottonwoods. These trees are high in salicylic acid, which the Viceroy caterpillar stores in its body. Salicylic acid is the active ingredient in aspirin, great for headaches, but bitter and prone to upsetting the stomach of a predator. So what we have instead are Mullerian mimics, 2 species with similar traits, in this case a bad taste, that look very similar to each other, which benefits them both since predators will avoid both. Viceroy caterpillars, though, don't display aposematism like monarch caterpillars. Instead, Viceroy caterpillars and their chrysalises look very much like bird droppings, helping them to be camouflaged from their primary predator, birds, who wisely don't eat things that look like their own poop. Unlike monarchs, Viceroys don't migrate, and adults don't overwinter. When the days grow short, late-season Viceroy caterpillars use silk to secure leaf stems firmly to the branches. Then they roll up the leaves and shelter inside through the winter. As soon as fresh leaves grow in the spring, the caterpillars emerge from their leafy sleeping bags, go back to eating, perform that voodoo nature magic of pupation, and in just a few weeks, there'll be new adult Viceroys fluttering around. And on that happy note, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. Remember, if you want to support monarchs, plant that native milkweed. Fall is actually the best time to do it, since milkweed seeds need to freeze and thaw to soften their coating. But if you want to support the podcast, there's never a bad time to do that. You can do that in a number of ways. First of all, consider becoming a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month. You can find all the information on that at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. If you want to make a one-time donation or send me an email, that address is the same, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. If you want some sweet logo merchandise, check out our merch store, cafepress.com/shop/dispatches from the forest. Lots of things there. I'm sure you'll find something that you like. For additional content, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.